say it is, but Ram Guha, in a quite interesting essay, once wrote that inside every thinking Indian is a Gandhian and a Marxist fighting to the death. You know, anthropologist among the Marxists, right? You know, we've had a little bit of Marx. In fact, in this afternoon we've had quite a bit of Marx, and so it's only appropriate that we have a little bit of Gandhi in our discussions for this workshop. And I think the best person I could think of to speak about that is Amit Basole. Amit is assistant professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts at Boston, but his background is very interesting. He hates being reminded of this, but he has a double PhD, one in neurobiology and neuroscience. I forget which one. Either one, all right. Both. And one in economics. His work is actually, his economics work is actually very interesting as well. He has worked extensively on looking at the weaving community in Benares, and has been doing a lot of work on lokavidya, trying to figure out whether there's different alternative forms of models for development and for thinking about how to handle the various crises that we undergo as a society. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing from Amit.
Thanks, Arjun. Thanks, Vamsi and Arjun and APU and the Advanced Graduate Workshop for giving me this opportunity. Very excited for attending and for giving the talk. Am I audible? Yeah. Okay. So there'll be actually Gandhi, but there'll also be some Marx. You know, so, we'll have both. So what I'm going to talk about today is a kind of a spin-off from my PhD thesis, combined with some work I've been doing with a group based in Benares, a group that goes by the name of Vidya Ashram, which is a collection of academics and activists who work on this idea of lokavidya, which Arjun mentioned briefly. And it'll become clear what lokavidya is and what the relevance to development is soon. So what I'm going to do is I actually wrote out my talk, which I almost never do, because this is not a talk where I'm presenting a lot of data. It's mostly just arguments. So I might read parts, which I apologize for. I usually don't do that, but some things I want to say exactly in one way, and so I might read some parts, and then I'll show you some slides as well. Okay, so you know, as most of you know, God died in the late 19th century. And his place was taken by science at roughly the same time. Science claims for itself the same kind of status that previously belonged to God, the only valid form of knowledge, the only legitimate way of understanding the world. Of course, there's a story to be told about the alliance that science makes with capital and the state. And I'll go into that a little bit further to establish its hegemony over the world of knowledge. It's not, science doesn't win purely, so to say, on scientific merit. It has a lot of help in conquering other knowledge traditions. And by what do I mean by other knowledge traditions? These are knowledge traditions of peasants, artisans, women throughout history, Adivasis all over the world, and so on, so on. These knowledge traditions are denied the status of knowledge after a certain point. And having made the vast majority of humanity ignorant, to rescue their humanity, there's a concept called dignity of labor. Right? Because you don't have anything else, you only have labor. Might as well have dignity of that. Now, this process, which I'm not going to great detail about, this conquering of science, of other ways of seeing, happens despite the fact that throughout the history of science, philosophers are struggling with the question of how to distinguish science and non-science. In philosophy of science, this is called the demarcation problem. How do you demarcate a boundary between what constitutes scientific practice and what doesn't? There's no answer to this, no easy answer. A lot of people tried. Most of you have probably heard of Karl Popper, whose falsification paradigm is one of the most popular ones. But there were others, and most of them, you know, by and large, these attempts were failures. There may be some disagreement about that, but it seems to be that there's no good way to distinguish. On the other hand, this doesn't stop. This doesn't stop the creation of a hierarchy in the world of knowledge, where science is commonly acknowledged to be the superior one. The proof of the pudding is in eating it. It is so manifestly successful in reorganizing the world that it is acknowledged to be the superior kind of knowledge. In development, of course, we recognize the hubris of science in terms of forced displacements, forced sterilizations, forced vaccinations, all of which are on a target population which is uneducated. So I'm going to come into that aspect a little bit later. Now, what is born here is what I call the knowledge scarcity paradigm. Right? So the knowledge scarcity paradigm, basically what happens is all knowledge is equated with science and all science with Europe. There is this kind of thing that happens. Now, in the heyday of this triumphalist discourse on science in the early 20th century, Gandhi is one of the people who challenges it. And this is the context of this talk as far as Gandhi is concerned. So there are many Gandhis. When you start talking about Gandhi, people have different ideas of what you're going to say. There's the saint and the non-violence guru and all kinds of things. The running dog of imperialism, as the Marxists call them. I'm not talking about any of those Gandhis. I'm talking about a specific dimension of him. The one that challenges science as the only or the best way of understanding the world and organizing society, and the one that says that society is not actually knowledge scarce but knowledge abundant. There's a lot of knowledge in society, different ways of knowing the world, and we should pay attention to these ways of knowing. Now, what is the political significance of this move? That's important as well. By the time Gandhi is active in India, class politics, caste politics, gender, the feminist movement, they're all active at that point. They all have been, these cleavages in society have all been politicized. The one cleavage that is not politicized is what Sunil Sahasrabudhe, who is one of the persons who's influenced me a lot, has called the divide between the Pashchimikrit and the Bahishkrit Samaj. This is the divide that comes into existence with the colonial period. The Pashchimikrit Samaj constitutes that part of Indian society that gets a place in the modern institutions. Right? A place in the new society that is being born and created in the colonial period. The Bahishkrit Samaj, as the name suggests, for those who don't know Hindi, Bahishkrit means excluded, Pashchimikrit means westernized. These terms may not appear too lively today, but the divide that they point to is still relevant, I think. So there's a part of Indian society that doesn't get a place in this system. These are the peasants, these are the artisans, these are the Adivasis, and so on, who constitute the majority of society. Now, and they organize their lives and their livelihoods on the basis of this other knowledge, which, although I'm distinguishing from science, I'll right away point out is not tightly separated from it. I'm not interested in making non-porous boundary things. That's not what I'm emphasizing. But I am emphasizing distinct ways of understanding the world, which may influence each other by all means. So these are the people who organize their life on the basis of lokavidya. These are the people who are politicized in the Gandhian movement. So this division, or this political division in Indian society, we don't get it from Marx. We don't get it from the Phule, Periyar, Ambedkar tradition. We don't get it from the feminist movement. We have to go to Gandhi for this. That's his USP. And in the discussion, we can talk more about this if people have other ideas about this. Okay, and I should point out that in economics too, this division, which I'm calling Pashchimikrit and Bahishkrit, doesn't go unnoticed. I mean, there's a lot of literature on economic dualism, going back to Broke and Lewis, of course, and everybody that you're familiar with, that recognizes that colonial societies are divided into traditional and modern sectors. That was the language that they used. But there's a big difference between the technocratic or academic understanding of society as constituting of these two parts and the political understanding. And this is what we get from Gandhi. Now, in the 1930s and 40s, there was a vigorous debate in India on the future course of development. What should it be like? A lot of people participated in it. It was elite and popular level debate. The debate was happening in the context of 200 years of British rule. So, at the point when Indian knowledge traditions had already been denigrated and all of the story that we know, Macaulay and all of that. Even Indians who were talking about Indian knowledge traditions and their eclipsing and all of that were mainly interested in elite knowledge traditions. What they meant was Brahminical traditions. So the knowledge of the lokavidya of the peasants and artisans and so on was not really part of that discourse either. Right? So I want to distinguish this elite discourse on Indian knowledge, going back to the Vedas and so on, which today we find in the Hindutva brand of sort of we knew how to build this and that, and we knew how to do everything before everybody else. That's different from what I'm saying. The idea that people's knowledge or lokavidya should be the basis of Indian society, which was Gandhi's idea, was an unpopular idea, even at that time. I'll just show you two quotes from a famous Gandhi-Nehru correspondence from 1945. They exchanged a couple of letters on this issue, and you'll see immediately what I mean. So Gandhi says, the moment you talk to Indian peasants, they begin to speak to you, you'll find wisdom drops from their lips. Beneath or behind the crude exterior, you find a deep reservoir of spirituality. I call this culture. If I have my say, our Governor General or Premier would be drawn from the peasants. It's a very standard Gandhian view. Nehru replies, I don't understand why a village should necessarily embody truth and non-violence. A village, normally speaking, is backward intellectually and culturally, and no progress can be made from a backward environment. Narrow-minded people are much more likely to be untruthful and violent. He's challenging Gandhi on the idea that there's something holy about the village and non-violence. According to Nehru, which is the modernist perspective of the time, there's nothing of the sort. Now, parenthetically, I should add that Nehru himself and his planner, P.C. Malnavis, when they were doing the second five-year plan, which is very famous for public sector, heavy industry and all that, were forced to acknowledge that the vast majority of Indian society at that time, as today, relies not on heavy industry but on lokavidya for its livelihood. So the second five-year plan actually is interesting in this regard. It has a big section on small-scale industry, reservation of items and so on. All of that comes from the second five-year plan. And I owe this, by the way, to Rajesh Bhattacharya, who is at the IIM Calcutta, who has done some interesting work on this part of the second five-year plan, which is usually not discussed so much. Okay, so the climate at this time is the prevalent view is one of modernization theory. And what does modernization theory say? Over time, development equals modernization. These societies will be modernized. Traditional economies will disappear. The formal sector will take over. Right? That is a standard understanding. So there's a very good summary of that in the informal sector manual that was 2007 actually, I think this came out, survey of informal employment. It's a government of India thing. It's a nice summary. For many years, governments and economists assumed that with the right mix of economic policies and resources, poor traditional economies would be transformed into dynamic modern economies. In this process, the traditional or informal sector was expected to disappear as the formal sector grew. But, as the report continues, contrary to expectation, informal sector and informal employment have not disappeared but have grown everywhere. We've already seen this part. We saw yesterday when we talked about debates on industry that industrial employment has stagnated. And by industry, we mean large-scale formal industry. On the contrary, there is some work, for example, done by Tirthankar Roy, who I often don't agree with in terms of ideological view, but has done a lot of work on showing the expansion of craft towns in post-colonial India, that artisanal centers like Moradabad or Surat or Bhadohi, all of these, I'm more familiar with the north, which are artisanal centers, don't die, they actually expand greatly. And there's a connection here between of course, what the global economy is doing and what these artisanal centers are doing, which I can go into if there's interest. But anyway, so I want to show you a few kind of consequences of the knowledge scarcity paradigm. Right? If you view society from the point of view of knowledge scarcity, what do you see? And this is not by any means to fault the NSS, which otherwise does an excellent job. But when it comes to this, these surveys are not very useful. So here's a couple of examples, purely for anecdotal value. On the left is a table from the third census of small-scale industry, which came out about 10 years ago, I think. And they had a question about source of technical know-how. They asked small firms, where do you get your know-how from? And the numbers speak for themselves. Most of them, 89%, don't get it from anywhere, which is, of course, spectacularly useless if you want to understand what's going on there. The survey doesn't capture what's going on because it doesn't ask the right questions. Firms don't operate without knowledge, everybody knows that. But they're getting it from somewhere which is not captured by the survey, which obviously all of us know the answer to. Right? Informal flows between firms, apprenticeship systems, senior workers training junior workers, all the stuff that we know we're familiar with, that occurs in the real world, where people without any formal education routinely perform skilled jobs as well. NSS similarly, if you go to the NSS, you don't find out much. You see from the unemployment surveys that most people don't go beyond middle school. The vast majority say they have no vocational or technical training, formal or informal. And informal training is defined very, very broadly. Despite that, people say they don't have any. Either they're not understanding the question or I don't know what else is going on. There's an older NSS survey from '93 that specifically asks about skills, and only 10% of the people say they have any skills. Right? And on the basis of this survey, the Sengupta Commission report, which is otherwise a very good report, concludes, and I quote, nearly 90% of the population above 15 years did not have any skills. A very monumental conclusion. A very ignorant nation where the vast majority of the working class has no skills. But again, this is, everybody knows this is not quite right. There's something that is missing here, and that missing bit is this world of knowledge that is easy to miss if you're approaching it from that particular point of view. Okay, so where does Gandhi come in? This part probably you've already guessed. What I'm going to try and do is recast Gandhi's emphasis on village industry and cottage industry and all of that stuff in knowledge terms. So conventionally we've understood Gandhi as a champion of village industry, like khadi and all of that stuff. And typically he's understood as a, sort of, if you want to put it in economic terms, labor-intensive industrialization champion. He talks a lot about how machinery shouldn't be used to displace labor and how we should create employment in the more labor-intensive sectors and all of that, which is fine. I'm not challenging that understanding. But I want to add another dimension there, which is a knowledge dimension. He's interested in this not only because it's capital, the capital is cheap or labor is plentiful or whatever. Capital is scarce or labor is plentiful or whatever. He's also interested in it because these industries draw upon knowledge that is most widely spread. It draws upon what people already know and can build on that. And I can present a few quotes. I don't want to put too many quotes here. One here, he's talking about khadi. Khadi, what does it mean? It means a swadeshi mentality. It means a determination to find the necessaries of life in India through the labor and intellect of the villages. Here I'm interested in that part of the quote that talks about the labor and intellect of the villages. Here's another one. Again, the view is of the village being self-contained and all of that, but here's what he says about the character of industry. Right? There's no objection to villagers using modern machines and tools that they can make and afford to use. So there's an emphasis, there's no sort of attachment to craft and tradition for its own sake. The emphasis is on what people can do, what people know, and how you can build on that. There's a dimension to this, which is where I'll bring in the Marxian tradition a little bit. There's a dimension to this, which Gandhi also recognizes, the dialectical relationship between work and knowledge. Yesterday there was a question, somebody asked after Sujit Mazumdar's talk about why we should care about industry. Why isn't it enough to be happy with service-led growth, for example? One answer, there are many answers to this. One answer is that industrial activity is always linked to knowledge production and innovation, far more closely, I think. So a dynamic industrial sector has a lot of positive externalities with respect to knowledge that may not be there in other sectors. And this is not just true of large-scale industry. This is true of all industry. And that's what we are talking about today. So when Gandhi talks about this relationship, he's interested in small-scale industry, artisanal industry. So he puts it as, here's one quote from him. Since the wanton destruction of this central village industry, he's talking about spinning and weaving, and allied handicrafts, intelligence and brightness have fled from the villages, leaving them inane, lustreless, and reduced almost to the status of their ill-kept cattle. intelligence and brightness have fled. I understand it as because work is gone, and not just because idle people are stupid or something like that, but because the process of work is what links you to the knowledge that exists in your time and to the production of new knowledge. Right? That's the relationship. And how is it understood in the Marxian tradition? Well, a great source for this is Harry Braverman, whose book probably most of you know about, but if you don't, then you have to read it. It's an old book, but still quite insightful. It's called Labor and Monopoly Capital, the Degradation of Work in the 20th Century. And it talks about the de-skilling of artisans under capitalism. So Braverman is talking about the relationship between craftsmanship and knowledge. And he says, as craftsmanship is destroyed or increasingly emptied of its traditional content, the remaining ties, already tenuous and weakened between the working population and science. Braverman is using the language of science. I would put knowledge here, are more or less completely broken. So this divorce of science from its artisanal roots is a theme that is common in this type of historiography. A lot of Marxist historians, anarchists have noticed it. Kropotkin has a nice sentence somewhere where he says that he is reflecting about old days, and he says in olden times the men of science did not despise handicrafts. Right? What he means by that is there was a relationship between the two, right, which later disappeared. And I can give some sources for people who are interested in this. But the interesting thing to note is that the relationship between artisanal production and scientific knowledge continues throughout the Industrial Revolution in England. James Watt, George Stephenson, all of these people, that are famous, iconic people of the Industrial Revolution, they were all craftsmen. They were all artisans. People like Francis Bacon, Robert Boyle, who are all major figures in the history of science, one of the things that they did was to study artisanal practice of the time as a way to understand what is known about the world, because that's where the knowledgeable people were. David Landis, who has a book on the Industrial Revolution in England called The Unbound Prometheus, talks about how the artisans of the time were not, later they were made out to be what Landis calls unlettered tinkerers. Right? Unlettered tinkerers, not educated, sort of just trying this and that. Does this work, doesn't that work, trial and error, that kind of thing. He says that that's not entirely true. There was theory, there was a system, and he emphasizes, most importantly, the growth of scientific knowledge owed much to the concerns and achievements of technology. There was far less flow of ideas or methods the other way. So science is being born out of technical knowledge, artisanal knowledge, much more so than the other way around. And then Braverman has another place in the same book where he notices that apprenticeships in the crafts included things like mathematics, algebra, geometry, and so on, properties of the materials that you're going to work with, mechanical drawing. A lot of technical fields were part of the craft apprenticeships. Now, those who are familiar with labor process theory in Marxism and so on will know that this rupture from going from here to the hierarchically organized modern factories, that's where all the action is in terms of what happens to artisanal knowledge and the emergence of this new hierarchy where artisans are no longer considered sophisticated or whatever. They have some knowledge, some craft, whatever they have, but the real thing is elsewhere. And one of the main prophets of this transformation is, of course, Frederick Taylor. Again, a highly recommended book for those who haven't read it, The Principles of Scientific Management. Seems outdated, 1912. It's talking about a completely different world, which doesn't exist anymore, you can say, perhaps in some way, but important insight for what was going on at that time when Gandhi was also writing. So Taylor is interested in reorganizing the labor process to take away autonomy and direction from the worker to the manager. And he conceives of this in knowledge terms. So he says, this is a quote from him, managers recognize that workmen included in the 20 or 30 trades who are under them, people you are supervising, they possess a mass of traditional knowledge, a large part of which is not in the possession of management. Managers don't know all this stuff that workers know on the basis of which they organize their work. But in Taylor's system, what does he envision? He envisions that the managers will assume the burden of gathering together all of the traditional knowledge which in the past has been possessed by workmen, and then of classifying, tabulating, reducing this knowledge to rules, laws, and formulae. This is his vision. So you take all the knowledge, you systematize it, and then you give it back in pieces, small pieces, not very big ones. How small? For those of you who've seen Modern Times, right? This is a caricature of the Taylor system, where Charlie's job is to tighten a nut. It brings out this complaint of the period, which is actually quoted there. This is a workers' journal from the late 19th century, which says, what is this modern system of work that is coming up? Basically, it gathers up scattered craft knowledge, it systematizes it, it concentrates it in the hands of the employer, and then it doles it out again in the form of minute instructions, giving to each worker only the knowledge needed for the performance of a particular relatively minute task. This organization of work which emerges in that period, the high point of which is the Fordist assembly line and all that stuff that we know very well, later disappears. In the neoliberal period, there's a pretty big restructuring that occurs there, but I can get into that if people are interested. But I want to give the Gandhian context here. So it is this movement to make the artisan something which he is not, or which she is not. A person who receives minute instructions, small ones. That's the move that workers resist. That's the transformation that actually doesn't occur very well in a lot of societies like India, where there's still a lot of production that happens on the basis of artisanal knowledge. And Gandhi is about politicizing that, about organizing those people and saying that world is not yours. Don't let it be organized by those principles. And I'll go into that a little bit towards the end, what principles those are. Incidentally, I don't have too much time to talk about this, but those of you who know of Gandhi's idea of Nayi Talim, which is his educational program basically, has some connections here too, because that program is very much envisioned as education through the hand. The head and the hand are not divorced, as they are in all modern education systems. We have a tight division between mental and manual labor. It's an old division, it's not new, but in capitalism it takes a newer form, where a lot of production knowledge as well gets divided into mental and manual labor, right? As opposed to the old days where mental labor of the Brahminical kind didn't have much to do with production and reproduction of society. It had to do with telling you your place in the world and things like that. But under capitalism, even knowledge of production and reproduction becomes so passive. It becomes, there are engineers and then there are the technicians. There are agricultural scientists and there are farmers. They both have knowledge about the same thing, but it's very different kind of knowledge and it has a different status in society. And by the way, if the agricultural scientist, for example, makes a mistake in whatever it is that they're doing, then they can retract the paper or suffer some maybe ignominy in the scientific community or whatever. If the farmer makes a mistake, of course, he pays for it with a lot more. So lokavidya has that feature, which a lot of formal knowledge doesn't have. It's existential. It is produced in your living and your working. And mistakes are much more costly sometimes. I just note that in passing. Okay, so having given this context, I want to talk about a more recent event, which is the rise of lokavidya in development thinking. It's not known as lokavidya, obviously, this is the word that I'm using. But in development thinking, it's thought of as traditional and indigenous knowledge. You may have heard of these phrases, and there's a lot of literature now. The World Bank has produced multiple volumes. A lot of people are writing about traditional and indigenous knowledge and its importance in designing development paths. So I want to talk a little bit about why we are seeing this particular rise of, PKIK, as I call it, traditional knowledge and indigenous knowledge. Why are we seeing it now? And how is it related to the earlier Gandhian perspective? lot of people have written about this shift that has happened in the last 30 years, going from the industrial society to the knowledge society. Knowledge society is a word that is thrown out a lot. India also has a knowledge commission that wants to make India into a knowledge society. Now, a lot of this is, of course, rhetorical, and there's not much real basis to it, but there are some important differences that we have to take into account. There are two major shifts that occur, right, in this period since the 1970s and 80s, which gives rise to this whole discourse. The first is the demise of the Keynesian welfare state and the rise of the neoliberal regime of accumulation that most people know about. I'm not going to say much about that. The second is this revolution in information and communication technologies, which happens together with the rise of the neoliberal paradigm. So the rise of the ICTs, as they are called, right, the internet and all the other things, makes possible the reorganization of production and accumulation and so on. So what are the main differences? Well, there's a kind of shift in discourse from emphasizing accumulating physical capital. You know, in the old days, the mark of progress was dams and factories and all of that. How much steel do you produce? That was the big mark of pride in the old days. And the Soviet Union was accused of fudging its steel numbers to show that it is more developed than it was. Well, now nobody talks about how many tons of steel it produces. Something else, computers, how many software engineers or whatever else it may be. So the emphasis is on accumulation of intangible capital, human capital and so on, as it's called. In the previous paradigm, labor is basically organized in a large-scale industry way, right? Hierarchies, centralized production. In this case, it's knowledge that is organized and managed. Labor can do whatever it wants. It's dispersed. Nike doesn't have any factories. It doesn't need to have any factories. Nike is not about a factory, it is about a brand. All the real value added in the Nike shoe is all in the brand. The shoe itself can be made wherever it is can be made, we don't care. It can be made by a woman sitting inside her home in Thailand. So that is a major shift that occurs in this period. Labor is scattered, knowledge is organized. There are other dimensions to this, I won't belabor it, but the one that is of interest to us is that incidentally, science's monopoly. This is the one right here. Not so much anymore. And this is what I was mentioning with the PKIK. People are more and more willing to accept, because of this shift in discourse in college society, because it's a knowledge society, we can pay attention to who has knowledge. And it turns out not just only educated people have knowledge, all other people. And this gives rise to some amount of flattening of hierarchies. It's modest, but there is a presence on the radar register of types of knowledge that we're So I want to say that there is a link between the two. The coming of the ICTs, the rise of the so-called knowledge society, excuse me, rise of the knowledge society, and the rise to visibility of other knowledges, PKIK, stuff that Gandhi was talking about, but which was not very important in those days. People weren't used to paying attention to it. Now it's not just the academics who have noticed that developing societies have a lot of knowledge which has nothing to do with schools and colleges. People who never went to school and college have important knowledge that is relevant for development. This, academics have recognized it, but activists are also not behind it. So here's a quote from an activist who unfortunately passed away, Sanjay Sangwai, who was an activist in the National Alliance of People's Movements, NAPM. People may have heard of NAPM. Here's what he's saying in an EPW article. The conventional development model is based on the notion that there exists only one linear knowledge base. Right? That's the scientific knowledge. The new consciousness, which is arising in the people's movements, this is an article about the people's movements. The new consciousness questions its supremacy and validity, and it appreciates the plurality of knowledge of every community and group. It is replacing a hegemonic concept of knowledge. Right? He goes on, if we limit the vast spectrum of knowledge to colonial or Brahminical approaches, then we are deprived of a rich and varied world of knowledge, expressions and production processes that common people have developed. So Sanjay Sangwai is contrasting lokavidya with colonial and Brahminical. That's his words. Different people may have different words, but it's pointing to these two elite knowledge traditions. The knowledge that is emerging in this TKIK perspective, or what Sanjay Sangwai is talking about, is neither of these two. It's something else. Now, I should point out, much before academics or activists noticed this knowledge, capital had already noticed it much before. Right? It's always the leading edge. So this labor organization, reorganization that I was talking about, this is precisely what it is. Now you can draw upon the knowledge of the entire global working class, educated or not, whatever it is, for your process. Making soccer balls, or shoes, or cell phones, or whatever you have, whatever commodity you can think of can be broken up and parceled into small shops and homes. So you're drawing there upon knowledge of the workers who, however they may be trained. No state has undertaken the training of these people. So capital is essentially free riding on the knowledge commons that is developed by the people. None of these have acquired their skills in any paid form whatsoever, whether subsidized by the state or whatever. It is entirely informally acquired through apprenticeships and so forth. Capital is able to use that knowledge, and they figure it out very well. The ICTs are key in this. Without ICTs, it's very difficult to organize such a global production process, which occurs in 13 different countries, and all of that. So the technology is key in allowing this, but it has occurred nevertheless. Okay, so I want to end with what would be a Gandhian response to this new TKIK business, because this discourse is everywhere. Here's, for example, a World Bank report which was called Poor People's Knowledge. Poor People's Knowledge is a report produced to argue that intellectual property rights should be strengthened in developing countries so that people can earn incomes on the basis of their knowledge. Right? This is another term, by the way. There are lots of terms floating around in the literature on what to call this thing. So this is a very pro-market approach to this issue. We know that there are people out there with this knowledge. How can they earn an income from it? But that's not the Gandhian perspective. I'll focus very quickly on just 2 or 3 main points of difference. First of all, the simple ones. The TKIK view, I might have a thing. Yeah, here it is. The TKIK view is basically, it views non-scientific knowledge as bits of things to be incorporated as needed, whether in development or into science or whatever. A lot of people talk about, for example, we need to examine all the richness of Ayurveda and this and that and test it in our laboratories and see what is scientific and what is not, because it's all mixed up. Right? There's valuable stuff in there, and then there's all kinds of superstition and stuff going on. So when we apply proper scientific methods, we can distinguish those parts of traditional knowledge that are scientific from those parts of knowledge, and then we can incorporate it. Of course, this is going on. As opposed to that, the Lokavidya perspective, the Gandhian perspective, doesn't see knowledge as divorced from the ecology, economy, and culture that produces it. It is not a disembodied kind of thing that you can just take. It is produced out of a way of seeing the world, which is true for science also. Science is not just a collection of facts discovered, it's a way of seeing the world. It's an ontology. You have a theory of what the world is and how are you going to get knowledge about it. So all knowledge traditions are the same. It's not just science. Everything is like that. The other differences, simple ones. In the Gandhian framework, there's no dichotomy between traditional and modern. That's not the criterion. The criterion is what people have variously called epistemological decentralization or epistemological democracy. These are heavy words. All they mean is decentralized knowledge, use and production. So in the Gandhian view, that's the important thing, not whether it is traditional or modern or whatever, because you can't draw those boundaries. When you actually look at peasants' practices and artisanal practices and all that, and a lot of people have shown this, I can quote studies if you're interested later, you can't disentangle modern from traditional. It's very difficult to do it, because people are not making those decisions. I mean, when you are solving a problem or whatever it is, you're not deciding, oh, I won't do this because it's that. you're following a different logic. And so what emerges is a hybrid, more or less. Lastly, I want to say that, it's obvious that the entire World Bank literature and all of this underemphasizes the hierarchies. It is not interested in investigating what is the economic status of the people who own this knowledge. Can they be organized to challenge the order for a better life? I mean, these are not their concerns. Their concerns are how to incorporate it in the global economy. So that's again different from Gandhi's concern. I'll just mention one other thing for those who are interested philosophically on this. Akhil Bilgrami, who is a philosopher in Colombia, has done some interesting recent work on Gandhi, where he talks about how the Gandhian view sees the world as containing ethics out there in the world, not ethics as imposed by humans on the world. The point is that science, the scientific tradition, sees the world as brute. This is the old word used. It's mechanistic. It doesn't have any ethics or morals. We impart ethics and morals to the world. So we can do it on our terms. The Gandhian view is that the world makes ethical demands on us. It has morals inside it, independent of us, and we are binding to follow them. We live in the world. We cannot do whatever we want to it. This is another way of looking at it. And Bilgrami has done interesting work connecting this Gandhian perspective to some earlier 17th century European thinkers who apparently had the same idea, and who were fighting it out with the scientists. But that I won't go into for lack of time. But this is a key point, because this links to what is happening right now in, for example, Ecuador and Bolivia, with rights of nature, rights of Mother Earth, all of this stuff that is going on with the new left in these countries. Rights of nature, or the idea that nature has rights, or the Mother Earth has rights, or whatever it is that we're phrasing it, that removes the ethical agency from humans and puts it out there. Independent of us, it's out there. And we have to acknowledge that. And you see that everywhere. If you look at the discourse around the Niyamgiri mining, with the Dongria cones, what's happening there. The Dongria cones often say that the mountain, is not this sort of natural resource that you can do whatever you want with. It has its own logic and morality, and we recognize that. So there are these connections. If you start making them, you'll see them around. One last point that I want to make. Just as if you have a Marxist perspective, you see trade union struggles, better wages, better working conditions, as something more than just struggles for better wages and better work. You see it as a deeper logic, a class conflict, and you see in it the promise of a different world. But to be able to see that, you need to have a Marxist perspective. Otherwise, it's just a lobby group that is asking for more money, which is what a lot of other people think of it as. So, similarly, with this perspective, with the lokavidya perspective, the struggles against displacement of all kinds, artisans, peasants, they are not struggles against progress. They are struggles to establish the legitimacy of another way of seeing the world. But you don't see that if you don't have this perspective. Otherwise, they're just struggles to you as preserving miserable livelihoods. Why on earth do you want to hang on to your plot of land which doesn't give you adequate livelihood anyway? Or as standing in the way of development. So charitably, you can look at it as preserving livelihoods. Right? They don't know how to do anything else. At least don't deprive them of that. Or you see it as, standing in the way. With lokavidya perspective, you see that as something different, as an alternative way of staking a claim of another way of seeing the world. So the knowledge struggle, the knowledge aspect of the struggle is very important. This is what I'm trying to draw your attention to. All material struggles have an epistemic dimension. People who are interested in feminist struggles should look at Silvia Federici's work, Caliban and the Witch. Very good work on witch burning in Europe, and where she shows how to subjugate women, you have to first destroy their knowledge, their claims to their knowledge, which in this case was things like healing, contraception, reproduction in general. Women were very knowledgeable about this. So to reduce the woman from a figure who holds these kinds of knowledges to somebody who is basically by the 19th century an unproductive housewife. For that you have to do this. Finally, you take the knowledge of contraception, which was every woman's, and now you can deny it to them on the basis of morals. This is a very clever shift. But first you have to destroy that. So these things are always going on in the background, and once you acquire this perspective, you'll see that. Okay, so I will stop with this, and we can take questions. Sorry for going over a little bit.
I am from IIT Kharagpur. So I just beg to differ to you on one account. The very topic of this presentation, perspective of Gandhian model of development, what I could perceive from your presentation is it has got nothing to do with development as such. Rather what Gandhi spoke was a lot to do with a social change or a positive social change. The society and social change can take place even without development. Societies didn't stop changing even before the term development was coined. That's one. Second, when Medha Patkar ji protests against any development project anywhere in the country, people say that she is following a Gandhian perspective. Does that what Gandhi said? Progress without growth. And your comments on that, sir. Thank you.
A very important point when you said that Gandhi saw the morality and ethics out there in the world, and the science sees is that we have to impose it on the world. But I think that Gandhi's perspective here springs from more of a deeper, philosophical point of view, which sees that the world has its own morality and ethics, which is he calls Sanatana, and the science, because of the science view is more of a Western Abrahamic kind of view that morality comes from a single source, maybe God, and who imposes this on the world, and we have to follow it no matter what. And there's just one perspective which is true, which has to be imposed on the entire world. So is it science per se, or it is because the science has developed in the Western world that it has acquired this kind of Western and Abrahamic kind of a tilt?
Brief question. One is that when you are saying that their defense or their articulation against displacement, that we can understand this way. But the question is, that is, we are understanding at the point of displacement. But suppose that without displacement, they are in a miserable position. So from that miserable position to go to a better position, what kind of political intervention can take place? That is first. Second is, how can we understand the class question with this knowledge kind of perspective to build up an alternative?
Yeah, I don't know whether I've understood completely, so it's kind of a clarificatory question too. When you concluded by saying that struggle against displacement and other things is like we cannot understand without a Gandhian perspective, but how it is very different from an understanding of primitive accumulation, and we can understand it from a very Marxian perspective too, and why do we need a Gandhian perspective for it?
Yes, so you are absolutely right. Gandhi is not interested in development. We can understand dimensions of him that are relevant to development, and this is because development is defined much more narrowly. So one of the things that Gandhi does, if you read Hind Swaraj, and I should have recommended that first, the most infuriating book you'll ever read, and don't put it down before you finish it. You will disagree with everything in it, but still read it. One of the things he's trying to do is question what we want. What is a good life? And the question of development is, of course, a very, very small part of that, because what we understand by development, whether it is rise in per capita GDP or structural transformation, growth of industry, whatever it be, right? Wearing Western clothes, speaking English, there are many ways to quantify development, and we can do all of those, but Gandhi is about much more than that. So you are correct in saying that this is nothing to do with development in that narrow sense, but it is something to do with what we think development points to. I mean, if a pure increase in GDP is no good, speaking English by itself is no good, wearing Western clothes and having nothing to eat is no good, and so on. Right? So ultimately it's about bigger questions. That's what Gandhi is about. Medha Patkar is thought of as being Gandhian. Now, and I also gave a quote from NAPM, which is of course also Medha Patkar's organization. I would say that by and large, yes. I mean, when she is opposing dams, or by guy her just, anybody really. That's the most obvious face of it. But if you view it from the modernization paradigm, then you can only come up with a few responses. You can come up with, we will rehabilitate you properly, we will resettle you properly, we will be just to you. I'm leaving out the actual thing that happens, which is we'll throw you off and not care about you. Right? I'm assuming nobody wants that. At most you can say we'll rehabilitate and resettle you properly. Any other thing is basically anti-progress. But I'm saying that is only from this one point of view that it is anti-progress. If you adopt the point of view that the tribals or the Adivasis take, it may not be. And this is not an argument, by the way, for saying the Adivasis are happy in their mountains and they should remain there. Right? Just as the argument for lokavidya is not saying, oh, you didn't go to college, no matter, you have wonderful lokavidya. Why do you need to go to college? That's not what I'm saying. But as long as you acquire knowledge, you go to college or whatever it is, on the terms of a system that is alien to you, you are always going to lose. If you think that you as a worker are going to be very happy with the things given to you by the capitalist, good working conditions and wages, you're deluding yourself. Those can be withdrawn at any moment. That's the essence of something that is given to you. Right? So that's the difference that this perspective puts. Okay, so the second thing was science versus the specific kind of science that originates in Western Europe. Well, yes, so science is shorthand for a lot of things. And I am open to being attacked on there can be other kinds of science, and there obviously can be. And one of the things is to point out that science has been equated with a particular way of doing things, but all knowledge production has elements of what we call science in it. Right? Everybody does experiments, everybody discovers empirical truths, everybody generalizes from one experience to the other. I mean, these are all elements that are common to all knowledge generation. But we don't have to equate them with the institutional symbols of science. So the other thing was, even without displacement, the third question, there's a miserable existence. What do we do? Yes, absolutely. So the displacement point is really only when it comes to the last point. Right? Even before that, there's a much bigger struggle that is going on in terms of the viability of this way of life. And I'm not talking about just peasants anymore. Okay? The Bahishkrit Samaj includes an entire society that is always being pushed. They're not always being displaced, but they're always being squeezed. And this is orthogonal to class in some sense. To preempt maybe another question that might come. Right? Why isn't class enough to understand it? Class doesn't always get you this. Because class conflict occurs everywhere. It including in Wipro, next door in those fancy buildings, which we are not talking about when we talk about this. So, yes, because this exploitation, if you want to call it that, Marxists won't like to call it exploitation because it's reserved for class, but whatever you want to call it, this transfer of resources from the informal to the formal and so on that we've also discussed is going on much before the displacement point comes. So you have to fight it at that point. There's no doubt about it. The class versus knowledge. Remind me, what was the second question? You had two questions. Oh, right. How do you see class? Yeah. So that's a good question, and actually that's what I guess I started talking about. Class in the Marxian sense is basically related to surplus production and appropriation, or ownership of the means of production, however you want to think of it. I'm not thinking of the Weberian income-based definition of class, which is not relevant for us here. If you think of class in the Marxian sense, then class differentiation and class conflict occur within the Pashkamit Samaj and within the Bahishkrit Samaj. They occur in both places. So that's how I mean that this is an orthogonal division. Right? Just as caste struggles occur everywhere in society, they interact with class struggles. So here again, this knowledge perspective which divides the society in this particular duality, and like all dualities it is open to question. The border is not very clear and so forth. But this duality is separate from the class duality. And you will not understand all the social dynamics if you try to reduce it all to class. Just as if you try to reduce everything to caste, you miss out the class dynamics. If if you think surely in terms of gender, you miss this. That's essentially what it is. It's another dimension of social struggles that has to be taken into account. And this is just an assertion. I mean, this is something that you have to think and decide if you want to accept it or not. Finally, why not just think of it as primitive accumulation, displacement? And yes, from the Marxian perspective, it is primitive accumulation. There's no doubt about it. The question is, what different things do you get if you approach it from this perspective? So in the Marxian perspective, primitive accumulation is necessary for capitalism to develop. I'm not very sure, and you can help me with this, whether primitive accumulation should be fought in the Marxian paradigm. And if it should be fought, what comes afterwards? Prabhat Patnaik has written about this recently. Do you fight for small property and then chart out a path for collectivization? Or do you let what is happening happen? Because the path to collectivization goes through concentration of property, in other words, primitive accumulation. So it's a little, you're in a difficult position because theoretically you can see a reason to let primitive accumulation proceed. But morally and ethically and as a political activist, you have to defend those with small property. Here I'm saying you don't have to have that mind. It's, you can think of it differently.
If we can have a, if we can have a follow-up kind of like, I don't think that we should necessarily see that primitive accumulation is necessary for the transition. I think Marx himself may not agree with it, like this kind of analysis. So that's what my precisely the question is, that we not see it as we not see primitive accumulation as necessary for the development of capitalism and then transition. We can actually have a different kind of setup. So that's the question, that why should we in a Gandhian perspective, and also to ask another clarificatory kind of question, like just sorry to do that, and like very briefly, like, so what are the parallels you can draw with something like alienation of labor with this kind of argument, or what are the differences, like basically? You obviously you pointed out for Harry Wehrman to be more clear, like.
So on the primitive accumulation point, again, I agree that it is primitive accumulation, and I agree that another path to socialism is possible. I don't want to be linear about this. But the question here is of a larger one. What status is this kind of knowledge going to have in the new society? Right? So here again, the question is one of, do you see these people as people to be educated and developed to become full citizens, or are they already as fully developed, educated, whatever political agents as your vanguard is? The vanguard is a vanguard for a reason. It has a class consciousness. It is not the vanguard because it is better educated, although we often confuse the two, and these two should be kept separate. So that's all I'll say about that. Alienation of labor, actually a lot of the Marxian tradition about alienation of the artisan and alienation of labor in the form of degradation of work relates to this. That's why I made those connections. This part of the Marxian tradition is very useful to understand why this hierarchy is born, this knowledge hierarchy that I was talking about.
About the labor process theory per se. So I was just thinking that there was one comment made saying that when knowledge is organized, labor becomes shattered. So I think this is a pretty old phenomenon, and not to be situated in the ICT influence alone. Because when artisans had monopolizable skills, they had a monopoly on the work. So once you reorganized in factory lines, like as E.P. Thompson's phenomenal work tells us, then the capitalists naturally bought out the time of the artisans, right? So I think it is an old phenomena which we now rephrase it with the new ICT kind of thing. And another question which I have is that, like, what we see among artisanal labor in India as such, like whatever workers we take, Agra leather workers or Moradabad metal workers, we see that the proportion of workers is declining. I mean, the second generation workers are not coming out. Does it mean that there is a death of this knowledge? I mean, this is a serious issue which the state does not. I was just wondering, how do we place it in this?
You know, we assume knowledge to be a product the way it is produced and the way it is validated, it's, you know, still what you would call probably to be Euro-scientific methods or processes. And there is a tendency again, you know, not only to accumulate knowledge, but also to, you know, glorify it. Now, I mean, in such a scenario or situation, how would, you know, a Gandhian perspective can actually fit in or, you know, create a different path or something like that?
About whatever I'm asking. So, my question is, if in a country like India, or maybe if you're looking at any underdeveloped country or a developing country for that matter, where education spread is not so much, as you showed the figures in the beginning, that we don't have the modern skills. So in that case, if the traditional knowledge is employment generating, then it would translate into growth, right? That is, I'm just asking. And how do you define scientific knowledge? Is it the Western scientific knowledge, or are we talking about scientific knowledge in all sense? Because if it is so, if you're only categorizing the westernized knowledge, then it might be a consequence of colonialism, right? So whatever that is how it has always been. Whatever came from the West is always superior. So are we essentially categorizing Western knowledge over what is maybe indigenous yet scientific? Or it's just a clarificatory doubt.
This is Priyadarshi from University of Hyderabad. Just an extension question from first question of Krishna Priya. Like Gandhi has said something of like on small scale industries only. His basic thoughts of development consists of means
where this hierarchy seems to have disappeared. Would you say it's disappeared, or you would say science is still the God, but a hidden God now, and what sort of in a hidden manner still continues to determine and organize the recognition of new other knowledges? And the question I have is from the Gandhian perspective and the struggle for lokavidya, which he represents and his thought represents, to which one could also add, I assume, Nandi and Varnashiva and what, which was dealing with a case where exactly science degenerated and sort of there was a looking down upon other forms of knowledge. To the system or to the processes prevalent now under knowledge society, where there is a celebration of these other knowledges, a commodification of these other knowledges, and a processes of alienation of these knowledges from the knowledge producers, which you point out. So what, and their intellectual property plays a crucial role here. So what can you suggest, what are the strategies on part of groups which are promoting lokavidyas, which is countering this, and how?
Gramsci, when he was criticizing a scholar who made an argument that every knowledge can be traced back to common sense, he critiqued this scholar and is making this argument that you can find any knowledge in the common sense because precisely of the fact that you want to find it, because anything and everything is common sense. So in relation to this, the question is, what is knowledge or what is non-knowledge? You know, how do you distinguish this? This is one. And the second factor is knowledge is political. Knowledge has a purpose. So a science which hegemonizes right now with a certain, if you subscribe to this particular way of looking at it, then it represents a ruling class's interest. And precisely by doing that, it subjugates the other knowledge units as non-knowledge, and so on and so forth. So, when it comes to this, then the articulation of saying something as knowledge is sorry, I told you I couldn't formulate the question properly, but yeah, it is like you are in a political conflict and trying to say your knowledge is also a knowledge, or a knowledge which is better than the other knowledge. So in these factors, how do you think Gandhi will help to make the lokavidya knowledge the hegemony, if at all it has to be done? Because you are in a conflict, so you can't say I'm as equal as you, because if you don't want to fight, you'll lose it.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief because it's a lot and there's no time. Very quickly, second generation artisanal workers are well, basically the same as second generation farmers, really. Nobody wants to do this because there isn't any future in it. In Banaras, I know specifically because I've done field work there. Now, does that mean that traditions will die out? Yes, of course. Should we be concerned about that? Not particularly. Because this is not a question about preservation of any craft. It's a question about controlling your own, it's about autonomy and destiny more than anything. Right? So it's not tied to craft. Yes, they are deserting their craft, obviously because it's not economically viable. If you can't earn a livelihood, you are not taking the responsibility to preserve a craft for the sake of the country or anything like that. So it's a question of the order of society. If society is reorganized such that some of these things become viable, people will do it. Otherwise they won't. But politically it's not a relevant question so much. Secondly, the Euroscientific perspective. So yeah, I mean there are a couple of questions about how to define science and whether we should equate it with European scientific tradition or not. I mean, two questions were sort of maybe hovering around this, if I understood it correctly. So we, certainly for us, the experience of modern science is a colonial experience, that's true. But the critique of science doesn't have so much to do with it being foreign. See, it's not a swadeshi critique in that sense. It's not a Hindutva critique of science, which of course is hypocritical in any case, but separately. Superficially, the Hindutva critique of science says it's foreign or whatever. That's not what it's saying. That is why I linked it to the Marxian tradition and the histories of science in Europe. In Europe too, the rise of science is linked to the denigration of artisanal knowledge, which is the mother of science. So science eats its mother, proclaims itself to be something. Right? So that logic is the same in different parts of the world. So that critique of science doesn't depend on it being in Europe. Anywhere where that happens, where you divorce yourself from work as the source of knowledge and create this section of people who are not working anymore. Their job is to produce knowledge. The other people's job is to apply knowledge, which in economics is justified as specialization of labor and efficiency and so on. There's a whole discourse that justifies this. But from this perspective, that is an evil thing, no matter where it occurs. So it doesn't matter if science is European or not, in that sense. Traditional knowledge will translate into growth. So first of all, again, I would distinguish traditional knowledge from lokavidya. Right? As I said, the second generation artisans may discard their craft, doesn't matter. That's not our concern. Growth is not the concern either. I mean, obviously, if you are from a very poor base, you want to increase your incomes. But growth is not the first principle. Growth will be an outcome of a just development process. Right? So that's all I would say about that. Large-scale industry and Gandhi, I mean, he has things he said about it, which might be different from what I would take away. Gandhi said so many things, many of which I have no use for. Large-scale industry, his views were that there may be some key sectors which have to be nationalized and can only operate on a large scale. So somebody asked him once, oh, you like this sewing machine a lot because it's wonderful, it does many things. But to make a sewing machine, you need all these stuff. You need big factories, you need steel and so on. How are you going to do that on the small scale? So he said, okay, well then have a big factory. So it's not very, kind of rigid in that way, or coherent if you want to call it that, in that way. And in any case, again, I would come back to this is a political question. See, we are not making a blueprint for which industries will exist and which will not exist. The process of industrialization is a political process. It is born out of the struggles in society. Large-scale industry comes into being because primitive accumulation can occur. You can't separate the two. Right? So nobody said this would be a nice, efficient thing to have. Let's do it. Right? Steve Margolin has a very nice paper from the 70s called "What Do Bosses Do?" It's a great paper. I recommend it, which argues that there's nothing inherently efficient about this process. It is just that capital is creating a need for itself in the production process. By parceling out work and division of labor and so on, you need managers, which you might not have needed before. So later on there's a discourse of efficiency and all of that can come. But it's all later, after the political fact is established. Then you can say this is a wonderful thing, right? Because it's already come to pass. The hierarchy has not disappeared. That's not what I was suggesting. I was suggesting that there's an opening. There's a destabilization, if you want to call it. There's an acknowledgement that there are other knowledges. That by no means means the hierarchy disappears. Again, Nelson's point as well, that you can't wish it away. You can't say, well, I've got knowledge too and then everything is all right. It's a political process. There is a opening perhaps that this allows. Because there is a discourse around it, everybody knows that there is something like this out there. Now how do you use it for your own purposes? That's the more important question, and that was your other question. And there again I would distinguish it from Nandi and Shiva. Nandi and Mandana Shiva are talking about similar things, but in my reading in a non-political way. It's an ideological position, anti-science. That has nothing to do with organizing people who are Baheshwari and a process coming out of that. See, that is again, keep coming back to that. This is an entry point that allows you to see a certain class of people, a certain group of people, from whose politics another society can emerge. That society doesn't have to be Ashish and follow Ashish Nandi's critique of that. There's nothing incumbent on that. There's nothing briding on that. All knowledge doesn't come from common sense. Absolutely. That's not what I intended to convey. I apologize if that came across. In fact, most of the things that we've been talking about are specialized knowledge. I mean, artisanal production says how to grow rice, how to grow this, how to make that, any of this stuff, or any, not even production, any knowledge that is sufficiently sophisticated is of course not common sense. It is arrived at through laborious processes. As Marx says, if appearance and reality coincide, there is no need for science. So you have to go through a process of generating these knowledges. The point is to say that this process occurs in many places, continuously. It's not to be monopolized by one bunch of people here. Okay, I think that was it. Oh, what did I miss? I can't, because as I said, lots of philosophers have tried and they don't know how to do it. We are categorizing a political economy that is organized on the basis of this knowledge. We are not trying to distinguish the knowledge. That is a difficult thing to do. But we can point to a way of doing things or a political economy that rises on the basis of it. That's all we can do.